we can start now. Good morning, everyone, to the Future Global Hub South Asia keynote titled Embracing Indigenous Knowledge in a Changing Climate, a Health Perspective. So the session is chaired by Dr. Parmesh. She's a visiting professor at the Devecha Center for Climate Change at the Indian Institute of Science. Coming to the speakers, we have Dr. Nicole Redvers, who is a member of the Denunqui First Nation and has worked with various Indigenous patients and communities around the globe, helping to bridge the gap between Indigenous traditional and modern medical systems. She is co-founder and chair of the Arctic Indigenous Wellness Foundation based in the Canadian North. Dr. Redvers is currently an assistant professor in both Department of Family and Community Medicine and the Department of Indigenous Health at University of North Dakota, where she has helped co-develop the first Indigenous Health PhD program in North America. She has been actively involved at the international level in promoting the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives in planetary health and education for sustainable healthcare. Her scholarly work engages a breadth of scholarly projects attempting to bridge gaps between Indigenous and Western ways of knowing as it pertains to individual, community, and planetary health. Our second speaker for the day is Mr. Suraj. He's a senior research fellow at the Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee. He's currently pursuing his PhD degree in sociology and is working in the Western Himalayan communities from socio-ecology and socio-climatological perspectives. He explicitly explores and analyzes the dynamic of traditional dietary practices in terms of climate change for sustainable food security and adaptation policies. Suraj Das will be talking about locating Indigenous beliefs in climate change adaptation policies through traditional dietary habits. So over to Dr. Parmesh for opening the session.
Thank you very much, Joshita, for a nice introduction. And it's one of the funnest topics we have. The next topic going to be on embracing indigenous knowledge in a changing climate, which is a health perspective by our resident professor Nicole Redvers. Dr. Nicole, over to you.
Thank you. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here. Bear with me for one moment. All right, so I'll just make the assumption that you can see my slides okay on your end. And if for whatever reason you can't, maybe the organizers can just let me know, but otherwise I'll go ahead. Thank you very much. Really happy to be here. It's about 10:30 p.m. at night here in Canada, where I'm currently located on unceded Algonquin territory, Indigenous peoples of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. However, as noted, my institutional home is at the University of North Dakota, which is the traditional homelands of the Lakota peoples, the Dakota peoples, the Nakota peoples, and the Ojibwe peoples. Now, one of the things that I always like to start my presentations with is really the same 5 slides, as regardless of which setting that I'm in or what I have stated before, I always have a responsibility as an Indigenous person to always root myself to my origin, my family origin, my community origin, but also set the context for why and how I speak. Now, this introduction is important from a decolonized clinical, but also research methodology. And from a clinician or a researcher standpoint, as an Indigenous person, I need to be in relation to my work, to my culture, and to my community. And it's important to locate myself in this purposeful way in order to demonstrate respect, but most importantly, to remain accountable to all my relations, or Salotina, as we say in my Denisutline language. Now, it's also important to note that my Indigenous ways of being, ways of knowing, but also my lived experience has been informed by tens of thousands of years of memories that are stored in my region's stories. And stories are our main method, if we could say, rooted directly in the lands that we come from. I like to showcase the quote from George Kajati, who really describes this relationship well by stating that the culture's vitality, our culture's vitality, is literally dependent on individuals in community with the natural world, Indigenous cultures are an extension of the story of the natural community of a place and evolve according to ecological dynamics and natural relationships. Therefore, I always need to honor my ancestors and my elders, as anything that I share or talk about from my Indigenous way of being is not my knowledge. This is not my expertise. It's a collective knowing of a group of people that stretches thousands of years. Now, our Indigenous methodologies for well-being, whether it's individual, community, or planetary well-being, stem from a rooted, decolonized state of being that is premised on what we could call 4 R's, that of which is respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility, with direct underpinnings, but also transferability to our kinship, what we call kinship relationships with all planetary elements and beings. Now, this idea of how we formulate our relationships are rooted in a framework of knowing that prizes at its fundamental base interconnectedness. So if we think about how to turn this interconnected worldview, this interconnected relationship into a methodology for health and well-being of the planet, well, of course, there's already a methodology. There's been a healing method in existence for thousands of years, and how to live and heal sustainably. All are based on what we call sacred natural laws, which then define traditional protocols, which are kind of like rules or guidelines for life, which then give a framework for the modern world scholarship, healing, and governance. Now, these sacred natural laws, sometimes we call them first laws, are traditional protocols, or again, our guidelines for life. And therefore, our frameworks for planetary healing are all done through the respect of ceremony, which is a critical action in reciprocity. So why does this matter? Clearly, our world has changed. We've went from this circular and natural worldview to a very square synthetic worldview. And I often ask folks to take a moment to really look at this image and see how it makes our bodies feel when we look at it. So how do we get back to our origin? How do we decolonize ourselves and teach others the natural laws and protocols that allow for a more sustainable world? Because the health effects are very clear. The land is a healing place, not just because of what it provides us, but what it gives us in relationship. Now, as Indigenous peoples, our relationship to Mother Earth, or planet Earth, as our mother, means that we'll do anything to protect her. So the risk, but also actualization occurring in many areas, however, in regards to what we could call the tokenization of Indigenous traditional knowledges without the consequent support for Indigenous land and place rights, really ensures the continued marginalizations of Indigenous people's knowledges over them as people and community. A focus on the knowledges as opposed to the peoples themselves who hold that knowledge. Indigenous peoples currently right now host and live in relationship with 80% of the world's biodiversity, and yet they live on only 22% of the Earth's surface. Yet we're still having our lands taken, being jailed or killed for defending our lands, and being subject to political marginalization, leading to some of the worst health inequities on the planet. And I want to repeat this, that 6% of the world's populations, Indigenous people make up 6% of the world's populations. Right now, 6% of the world's populations are taking care of 80% of the remaining biodiversity. Just maybe, Indigenous peoples are doing something right. Now, in addition, what many fail to realize is that violence against the land is violence against women, as we see so powerfully depicted in this artwork done by a young woman named Katie Douglas. Indigenous peoples live in parts of the world where its impacts are greatest and depend largely or exclusively on the natural environment for our livelihoods, culture, and lives. And as Vanessa Gray stated, the land is our mother, so when we lose value for the land, people lose value for the women. We are in a time of change. We've obviously seen a precipitous rise in carbon dioxide levels caused by anthropogenic or human activity. And despite the increasing, although arguably inequitable socioeconomic trends in our world, it has come at the cost of exponentially increasing strain on our natural systems. So we therefore term this period that we see on this graph as of great acceleration since about the 1950s as the Great Acceleration. And we can see very clearly across the graphs both the changes within socioeconomic measures, but of course the consequent change in the degradations of our natural systems around this great Earth. And as we search for ways to maintain ourselves within a very narrow window of improved social foundation, if we could call it, in the world, while not actually breaching our ecological ceilings known to perpetuate life for us and for all other life on the planet. All hands, of course, on deck are needed. And there's really no exceptions for any sector or peoples in that very great need. So I always ask, how do we think about solutions? And the term planetary health is a relative newcomer in the Western way of thinking and applying knowledges. And although conceptualizations of planetary health have been around in Indigenous communities for thousands of years, it was really formally defined in English in the last 10 years or so, maybe 12 years or so now. And its original origins within Western applications were very anthropocentric, so again, human-centric. And it's still somewhat the case today, to be frank. However, this is improving. The Planetary Health Alliance, which is based out of Harvard in the United States, defines planetary health as a solutions-oriented, transdisciplinary field and social movement focused on analyzing and addressing the impacts of human disruptions to Earth's natural systems, on human health, and all life on Earth. Now, if we consider an Indigenous approach, planetary health as a field is primarily a Western construct, as Indigenous traditional knowledge systems have no clear separation between the health of the planet and the health of self, or even that of the community and ecosystems at large. Now, when we think about planetary health, especially from an Indigenous perspective, we can think of it as being nested into an interconnected relationship with all other applied knowledges which impact the health of our communities and ecosystems. And what this means is that the actual meaning and application of planetary health are really directly rooted in community values based on protocols for living in harmony with all that have existed for thousands and thousands of years. Now, the lens of the world clearly affects how we see our innate hierarchies of ourselves over all other beings on the planet. And I really like this image by Lucero and Cruz because I think it does a really good job of highlighting this binary that often is assumed, with the left, of course, being current practice in many societies today, this very anthropocentric or human-centric approach to thinking through our lived experience, this ego, this I perspective, humans kind of on the top of the pyramid, and all decisions, going through humans without much consideration sometimes for the other elements of life on the planet. Comparatively to what the Mayans call cosmocentrism or cosmocentric, or what we could even consider ecocentric, where humans are nested within this interconnected system, no greater, no less than any other element or organism, living being on the planet, this eco, this we, this collective kind of approach with no innate hierarchy existing. Now, health equity considerations in research and practice are thankfully becoming more common in modern discourse, and this includes within the climate and health space. What is also important, though, as denoted here, is an interspecies equity approach that is really seen from a place of relationality or relationship. We are all interconnected with no hierarchy between us when it comes to how the natural systems operate within the world. And I often talk about equity from many different lenses. On the previous slide, of course, interspecies equity was highlighted. However, we also have to understand notions of what we could call intergenerational equity, which is a very prime consideration for Indigenous communities, often making decisions based on the effects of the next 7 generations to come. There's Indigenous people, the Haudenosaunee people from around the southeastern parts of Canada, as well as the northeastern parts of the United States. And they have something called the 7th generation principle, which essentially embodies that, again, we take the knowledge and guidance from the previous 7 generations, apply that knowledge today, always thinking about the effects for the next 7 generations to come. A very simplified form of that teaching, however, encapsulates this idea of intergenerational equity, because we have clearly been mortgaging the health of future generations to realize economic and development gains in the present. Now, this interconnected nature generationally is also depicted here by this figure on the slide, because again, we are unified communities due to our interconnectedness on all fields of structure and influence, no matter the place on the planet that you live, the latitude that you live, the peoples that you are. Yet there's also a very clear interrelationship with repercussions for not living in balance with the planet, as Earth-centered jurisprudence systems govern both nature and global systems. So there's this unity of natural laws between us and all elements on the planet. And how that's demonstrated is that things like the sun will continue to rise from the east where I am and set in the west. The moons will continue to affect the tides, but Mother Earth will also respond to our interactions with her, which ultimately affects all other life forms. Now, I've already noted that we are nested into an interconnected relationship with other applied knowledges which impact the health of our communities and ecosystems. And this bi-directional impact of these various nested levels, as you can see here on the figure, is incredibly important as we help to form our reality, just as much as we are bound by some of those constants, those natural constants that are guided by Earth-centered systems. So in thinking through the vision for a healthy future, it's important to create the conditions that really enable the overcoming of this dissonance between this idea of being in nature, going out into nature, nature that surrounds us, is outside of us, comparatively to being of nature, nature that embodies us, because we are in and of itself nature. One of the things that I'll often describe to people is when Indigenous communities often say that they come from the river, or they come from the mountain, or they come from this lake, that, although there's metaphorical implications of that story, often there's also physiological realities that come from that descriptor. One example is that, we'll often ask people is where do you get your drinking water from? And in my area, many people get the drinking water from, in this area, the river, in my home area, the lake. And then I'll say, okay, well, how much percent is your body made of water? Of course, our bodies are made of about 60% water. So when we drink that water from the river, or we drink that water from the lake, 60% of our body is lake or of river. We are in and of itself the river. We are in and of itself the lake. So when we say we come from the lake or we come from the river, there's actually a physiological basis for that statement that embodies this idea of that we are of nature. We don't go out in nature, we are a part, we are nature. So ultimately what we call natural law or first law, and again, this is how we term it in the English language. Many Indigenous communities have their own law terms that they'll use. In my area, it's Dene law because we're Dene peoples. Of course, we'd have terms in our own traditional languages. And natural or first law is essentially a way of living on land that's handed down through countless generations within Indigenous communities. and it sustains a web of relationships between the human and non-human world and forms a pattern which is life itself. And this pattern must be recreated in the law followed to sustain life. Now, as we saw in the previous figure, Indigenous traditional knowledges are directly nested within understandings of natural or first law, whose meaning again is very uniquely rooted within the respected lands globally. Adivasi people in your country, comparatively to First Nations people, Indigenous people in my country, have different interpretations of natural law or first law because they are uniquely rooted within the respective lands globally. And as Elder David Kushir, who's of the Anishinaabe Nation, Indigenous peoples within the United States and Canada, confirms that working in alliance with nature and her natural laws is the key to ensuring our survival. And the reason we have climate change is because we have broken natural law. So what is natural law, and how can we find our balance again? The spirit in each of our beings carries moral and ethical principles of what should be the basis of our human conduct. We understand these moral principles as natural laws. Natural laws are innate to all living beings. They are invisible laws that govern all life. All living beings, including Mother Earth herself, are governed by natural laws, whether they know it or not. And as we confirm and emphasize the Indigenous perspective that there is no separation between ourselves and that of the earth, we are in and of nature, with complete interconnections existing that really precludes an isolated definition. I reflect on the fact that even our Indigenous names and identities often come from this deep and fundamental understanding. I come, as noted, from the Dene peoples of northern Canada and the subarctic regions. We call this region Denede, or land of the people. And if we break down the word Dene in one of the Dene languages, which there are many, we see that De means flow and Ne means land, flowing from the land. So as Dene people, we have a relationship with the land. Our very being flows from the land and the land from its people. And this concept of flowing from the land roots us Dene in our landscapes, creates the culture, and as such, the teachings about the land serve as the essence of our being. There is no separation from the land, and when there is, that is when dysfunction arises. So why is this important for me to state? And I think of the words of Chief Dan George, who was a chief of the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation in the western part of Canada. And he said, "Allow me to learn the ways of your book knowledge so that I may combine it with my natural knowledge and lead the way." We as Indigenous peoples understand in many cases that a blend of traditional knowledges with modern knowledge is the only way forward sustainably for our planet. And I want to emphasize here the concept of what's called epistemological pluralism. It's a big word, epistemological pluralism. And epistemological pluralism recognizes that in any given practice context, there may be several valuable ways of knowing, and that accommodating this plurality can lead to more successful integrative study, solutions, and practice. And we are seeing change slowly happening, and I believe it's a deep reflection of the values, vision, and purpose of what we're trying to do as a collective community in this time of great crisis. But I also believe it was due to diverse voices standing up for their rights and showcasing the strengths they have to offer the global community, again, in this time of great crisis and need that we have as a humanity. Now, this has also occurred by allies of communities standing up and stepping back to allow those voices to be heard. And the more that we can continue to step back and uplift diverse knowledges, the more hope we have of getting us through these intersecting crises. And although Mother Earth is a living system that can transform and heal herself, as my sister Anne Paulina, a Nikanina-Wara traditional custodian from the Madarara Lower Fitzroy River in Western Australia states, she will be lonely without the vibrations of her human family. Now, Ann Polina and I and a group of Indigenous scholars, practitioners, land and water defenders, respected elders, and knowledge holders came together to define the determinants, what we call the determinants of planetary health from an Indigenous perspective. And we often hear, of course, about the social determinants of health, which are the non-medical factors that influence our health outcomes. And the social determinants of health are often described as the conditions in which people are born, grow, work, live, and age, but also the wider set of forces and systems shaping the conditions of all of our daily lives. And examples of these conditions can be things like income and education, food insecurity, but also even housing. And although, of course, these are incredibly important and not to be minimized, it was realized throughout these discussions with this group, however, that Mother Earth, planet Earth, was being left out of the equation as a living and breathing relative. And we really wanted to for once, place Mother Earth in the center and consider what are the determinants of health that keep her well? What are the determinants of the planet's wellness? What are the factors that will make an impact for her well-being? And I want to just highlight here a few of the determinants that I think are less well appreciated in wider climate and health circles. And I won't go into detail on all of them, and will encourage you to see the paper online if you're interested, as it's available open access at no charge. And the first is the human interconnectedness with nature determinant. And we wrote very specifically that ecological demise points to an impaired human relationship with its inner self, because humans are nature and not a part of it. In this broader sense, there is evidence of the loss of an ecologically bound cultural identity. And the disconnect that we have from nature manifests itself as a fragmented, but also dissociated identity that cannot recognize itself as part of a greater system, which makes it easier to project predatory and abusive impulses onto the environment. Thus, this ideology of independence has really resulted in a sense of entitled ownership, a kind of perception of the natural world that relates to it through transactional relationships that do not have a sense of responsibility, care, or love. And this worldview will only continue to perpetuate planetary harm. Now, another less appreciated determinant of planetary health that I want to highlight is that of Indigenous peoples' health. And we premise very strongly in our group's work that the health of the planet is intrinsically tied to the health and well-being of Indigenous peoples. Because when Indigenous peoples have their land, when they have their culture and sovereignty, they are more likely to have greater well-being. And because they have greater well-being, they will continue to be able to sustainably care for more than a third of the world's old growth forests and the most biodiverse regions on the planet. In fact, the remaining 80% of the biodiversity on the planet. Therefore, it's imperative that Indigenous peoples' health is approached from a holistic lens that acknowledges cultural, but also land-based practices as being crucial for human health and for the health of the planet. And we concluded our paper stating that Indigenous voices are a powerful and beneficial solutions-oriented force for Mother Earth's well-being and for all living beings that inhabit her. And we therefore call for an inclusion of wisdom that is not mere knowledge or information, but is an insight that comes from the heart of Mother Earth. Now, this paper provides the answer from an Indigenous perspective on how we can heal Mother Earth. And I encourage you again to take a look at it if you're interested to hear what Indigenous communities are saying to answer this important question. I must highlight, however, that Indigenous peoples clearly recognize the extreme crises that we're facing through our Indigenous science and ways of knowing, and the realities we're living on the ground. But if we agree to share this knowledge for the good of all humanity, it must be based on respect for our rights and the commitment by countries to implement real changes in their method of production and concepts of development. And I noted that the planetary health movement is really beginning worldwide, and it's gaining significant traction in and around both universities and organizations in North America, Europe, but also in many countries, which is very positive. However, planetary health is by no means an innovative new discipline. as is often suggested within many academic circles, but instead a deeply rooted connection that all of our ancestors had to this land as a medicine place. To understand the planet and its functions is to understand oneself in the Indigenous worldview. Now, if the climate change movement broadly is to be successful in my mind, it will need to platform itself as more culturally safe, critically conscious, and have a greater appreciation of currently marginalized Indigenous voices. We cannot forget in the complexity of our crises. And as Terry Teegee, who's a member of the Takwa First Nation in Canada, stated, take care of the land and the land will take care of you. Indigenous knowledges remind us how to walk in the world in a good way. And the path we hopefully decide to walk is together with Mother Earth as our relative. You cannot understand, in my mind, true medicine power, whatever capacity that may be, unless you have an understanding of the nature of things. And to understand the nature of things, you need to be in nature. You need to connect to the animals, the rocks, the planets, the stars, the plants, the winds. Now, with this, I want to say Masi Cho, which means thank you in my Denisoohline language, Masi Cho, for your time and attention today. And I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all to talk about these topics. They're deep and vast topics, so I hope this very brief introduction will at least stimulate some thought and consideration as you go forward with your own journeys within this climate and health space or in other spaces. And I will note additionally that I do share quite a bit of resources and publications on my professional Twitter or Facebook pages noted here on Indigenous peoples in reference to climate change and health, but also planetary health and Indigenous health broadly. So feel free to pop in if you're interested in this area. Otherwise, again, Masi Cho, and I welcome any questions, comments, or discussions at this time with support of the moderators. Masi Cho, thank you.
Nicole, congratulations, very well spoken, and I don't see any questions. Is there anybody can raise their hand, ask any questions? Well, if there any question comes, we will forward it to you, madam. Okay? But however, let me make your talk was excellent, predominantly right brain related stories and values, what you observed. We have to look for a left brain also with the legal aspect, that data, what we have to substantiate it. That's what everybody wants it now. But we definitely want to do that. The climate change is due to we are all breaking the law. So we are causing all those things. It's very well highlighted. And also, these are all the values we believe in. Thousands of years, we also believe the same thing in this context. And also, Isha Foundation in India is going save the land and save yourself. That is going around the spiritual leader, going across the country. Our Prime Minister also is visiting us today. He has mentioned it, we have to do it. I agree with that one. I think all this observation, we have already mentioned on the university, being one of the member of the academic council, think locally, act locally, propagate the result globally. Each one has got a traditional value. We have to keep it in mind. Any ideas will come there. And these are all observations over the years, what elderly people say that. He's an elderly person, a teacher himself in his field, having all the experience, tradition, living in the flow. And you create a question in that one. You hypothesize this, observing this the value, yes, hypothesize, then puts that into test, analyze, and conclude. It's a continuous process. So technology, we have to improve. We cannot live without that. So technology has to come there, and population growth is the only thing. Demand becoming more and more. We produce 3 times more than carbon dioxide what Mother Nature can able to handle it. So with these type of things, we have to put some left brain to work, and also you have put an input, initiation with your observation with the local thing, and we are very thankful for that. God bless you. Wish you all the best. Good night. And you go to bed. So sorry, we are disturbing your sleep. Thank you very much. Wonderful talk. We thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nicole. Thank you. So now I request Suraj Das to go ahead with his talk.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Myself, Suraj Das. I hope so much, ma'am. So these are the contents that I'll be talking about. The first one is the contextual meaning of climate change, where I'll be focusing on how indigenous community or the traditional community are associating the term climate change with their daily life. And then we'll talk about the concept of indigenous people and then dynamics of climate change and indigenous community. And in next coming slides, we'll further talk about the indigenous response to climate change. And last but not the least, the conclusion part. So as we all know, climate change is the defining issue of our time, and we are at a defining moment, from shifting weather patterns that threaten food production to rising sea levels that increase the risk of catastrophic flooding. The impact of climate change are global in scope and unprecedented in nature. So without drastic action today, adapting to these impacts in the future will be more difficult and costly. Why I have taken this definition? Because through this definition, we can see the climate change has been basically defined with the fluctuation or the unstable change in the various climatic variability like climate, precipitation rate, temperature, and rainfall pattern. But besides that, local community, according to them, climate change has various meaning. So they have basically associated the meaning of climate change with the atmospheric factors, ecological indicators, and the biological indicators. For example, so in this presentation, I'll be basically sharing my experience that I have gained in my exploratory research work in the Western Himalayan region. So these are few things that I'll be talking about. So in terms of atmospheric indicators, the local society they can associate the climate change with the changing pattern or the changing color of sky or the clouding pattern besides the standard definition of climate change. And through that, they can also predict the direction of the wind in the atmosphere. And in the longer run, due to these changes, the fluctuation in temperature, rainfall, and snowfall pattern can be observed. Similarly, the traditional community also associate climate change with the ecological indicators. So in the ecological indicators, they associate the change in climate change with the change in the direction of waves of river streams, landslides, drying of rivers, and forest fires. And due to that, the local source of water also gets affected, and that affects the farming practice and the household consumption pattern. And in the longer run, we can see the rise in the sea level, retreat of glaciers, change in the land use pattern, and the local ecology. Similarly, they associate also climate change with the biological indicators, that is changing in the flowering time of fruits and local plants, extinction of plant varieties, and due to that, delayed or early burning of the flowers that also affect the productivity level. For example, they have talked about the negative impact of early burning is the productivity of apple and apricot is decreasing in the recent decades. So these are the few examples which I have quoted here. So which I have quoted here. So in the next slides, as much has already been deliberated by Dr. Nicole on the indigenous community, but let's start with the basics. So who are indigenous people and the local communities? So typically, ethnic groups, they are ethnic groups who are descendant from and identify with the original inhabitants of a given region, in contrast to groups that have settled, occupied, or colonized the area in the more recently. And because indigenous communities have its own source of knowledge and understanding on climate change and its impact and adaptation strategies. And besides that, the traditional knowledge allows them to forecast weather pattern that we have seen in previous slides, improve agricultural practices that we'll be talking about in the next coming slides, and sustainably manage natural resources. And due to its significance, due to the significance of traditional communities' knowledge or the indigenous knowledge, even the IPCC's latest report have recognized the value of diverse form of knowledge. Besides the technological innovation and the scientific know-how, they have also emphasized on the integration of indigenous knowledge for the for building sustainable climate resilience environment in coming future. So these are the few dynamics of climate change and the indigenous community, which I have taken here. So as we all know, climate change is a clear example of dialectic of ecology and society, because the social conduct alter natural process, and these in turn alter social relationship. For example, due to the anthropogenic activities, climate change is happening. And if the climate change is happening, its impact can also be seen on the human beings. So they are dialectical in nature. Hence comes the role of indigenous community. So indigenous, besides that, indigenous community are among the first to face the direct consequences of climate change, and due to their heavy dependence on and close relationship with the environment and its resources. Similarly, climate change exacerbates the difficulties already faced by the indigenous communities, including economic marginalization, loss of land and resources, and discrimination and employment. So we have several examples to prove these points. For example, the climate change has affected their farming practices. In the earlier decades, as observed or as recognized by the indigenous community, that the practice, the nature of farming was natural in nature. But now, due to the changing land use pattern and the characteristics of land, they are using, or they are heavily dependent on the chemical farming for better production. So this is how the nature of farming has also been affected. Similarly, climate change has an impact on the traditionally consumed food sources. For example, in the Western Himalayas, in the earlier decades, the consumption of madhua and the kala bhat was the norm, but now it has hardly been produced. It is rarely been consumed by the local communities. Of course, there are several other factors like socioeconomic factor, income source, etc. But besides that, the local traditional communities have also recognized climate change as a significant factors affecting their dietary habits and their food choices. Besides that, due to the unpredictability of the weather pattern, its impact can also be seen on the social gatherings. Now, people are rarely gathering, even though they are still gathering, but the scale of gathering has been decreased in recent few decades, and its impact can be seen on the feeling of community. So, and why? And that has affected the resilience strategy of the local people, because at the time of climate-induced emergency, it is the local community who acts in togetherness. But due to the fading feeling of community, these things are not happening in sync with the earlier times. Besides that, due to climate change, the increasing incidence of forest fires are also happening, and its impact can also be seen on the locally produced flora and fauna. For example, buranj, which is a flower, and the kafal, which is a fruit. So why basically local people sell juice of buranj and kafal as a fruit, and they are also dependent on these fruit as their source of income. But at the time of forest fires, the productivity gets decreased, and that's how their local source of income also gets severely affected, and that in terms affect their food security, which has a negative impact on their health. Similarly, we have an example of at the time of climate-induced emergency, the impact can also be seen on the cattle rearing, because at that time the availability of fodder gets decreased, and hence here comes the role of gender dynamics, because mostly in the traditional household it is the women who take care of all these things. They usually fetch water, collect fodder for the animals, and do all the daily chores. But during these uncertain period, it is women which is badly gets affected. So overall, we can see the impact of climate change on human health, on food security in the Western region. So besides that, we have also seen that climate change is not only affecting their food choices, they are also affecting their traditional norms or their traditional belief system. And if policies are not made in sync with these, then the chances of policy paralysis are high. For example, during the early time, when the Swachh Bharat mission was initially launched, Government of India promoted the use of toilet, but most of the people don't know how to use the toilet in the Tamil Nadu region, and they were using the toilet, the toilet for fish, and that's how, because it was not in practice, and that's how the policy for few times for few generations, it was a kind of policy paralysis. So that's how if policies are made, it should be in sync with the locally or the traditional belief of the local communities. So these are, but besides that, there is a bright picture how indigenous communities are responding to climate change. For example, indigenous people interpret and react to the impacts of climate change in a creative ways. For example, the concept of gin gardening in the backyard. That's how they have been managing and tackling the worst impact of climate change since the time immemorial. We have another example: traditional knowledge, a product of learning through experience and the oral tradition passed over centuries, has been developed over generations through daily life practices and a close understanding of local environments. For example, Traditional practice of food preservations, that is chopping and sun drying techniques. So where here, which is mostly used in India. So basically, they chop the vegetables into small pieces and sun dry them for the future, for the uncertain periods. Besides that, they sometimes also preserve the meats. They also preserve the meat for the future consumption. We have another example. Cultural beliefs and festivals can also serve as a refuge, both physical, psychological for surrounding communities during and after emergency. For example, farm festivals such as Harela and the Baranaj. So there is a festival here. Here we have an example of significant farm festivals such as Harela and the Baranaj. What they do, they celebrate this festival in the month of July to mark the beginning of new harvesting season, and they grow 7 to 9 type of crop in the Harila festival, and in the Bara Anaj they grow 12 types of crop simultaneously. So these are the typical example of multi-cropping pattern, multi-cropping system, but enhance multi-cropping system. And if in the worst case scenario, more than if 1 or 2 crop gets damaged, they still have chances to get the crop from other grown crops. Similarly, some indigenous communities are striving to cope with the climate change by focusing on the economic opportunities that it may create by shifting their agricultural activities, which are less susceptible to adverse climatic conditions. So, as I already have mentioned, that the impact of climate change can also be seen on the traditional dietary habits. That is, there is a shift in their dietary habits, and people are also using it as an opportunities. So now what we have observed, earlier they used to grow wheat, but now they are growing the sunflower. The very reason is it is less susceptible to adverse climatic conditions and are good for the economic considered good for the economic opportunities. So in conclusion, we can say that indigenous beliefs are crucial for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Even the climate experts are unanimous with the fundamental association between cultural beliefs and the climatic change adaptation strategies. So resilience in the face of change is embedded in the indigenous knowledge and the know-how, diversified source and livelihood, social institutions and network, cultural values and attitudes. But the irony is that this system is already on the brink of disappearance in the Himalayan region. Still, the socio-economic cultural dimension is missing from the policy dialogue. Even the significance of various dynamics, it is still missing at the policy platform. Policy platform from every platform. For example, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, or the assessment report of the IPCC. The very reason for that is the manifestation. The very reason for the missing of indigenous perspective is the manifestation of the marginalization of indigenous people from the climate change policy, and decision making is the paucity of reference in the global climate change discourse to the existing traditional knowledge on climate change. Hence, policy response to climate change should support and enhance indigenous resilience. And lastly, the integration of indigenous perspective is imperative for sustainable food security and climate change adaptation policies. So this is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suresh Das, for your nice talk. Indigenously, what are the values we have? How best policymakers to adopt in making the policies for the future to save the Mother Earth? Anyway, is there any questions before I conclude?
Yes, there is one question. I'll share the screen.
Yeah. Just ask me. Yeah, ask me. Oh, okay.
So this is the question. So the 2020 Environment Impact Assessment draft in India proposes to reduce the notice period for public hearings from 30 days to 20 days. What effect do you think this will have on indigenous people? Suraj, the floor is open.
Yes, ma'am. To be honest with you, this is out of scope of my study. Actually, I'm exploring from the socio-cultural perspective, from sociological point of view. So commenting on the legal point of view, I can't say anything about this.
Yes, totally makes sense. But thank you so much. So I think apart from this, there are no other questions. So I request Dr. Parmesh to give the concluding remarks.
Well, to totally agree with you, certain values. I also am a believer of. I also made the previous statement, think locally, act locally, propagate
Right.
it globally. Earlier it was think globally, act locally. We have changed it. I think
Exactly.
that's what we have to do. That's what we have been recommending it. There are values of the kitchen garden is to be in the backyard. We have enough space. No, in the roof you make it, roof garden. We are making, there are certain, we have to adjust to the situation as a matter of fact.
Exactly.
Because most of these talks are only right brain development.
Right, sir.
Highlighted the value, you highlighted the importance of those observations. But the policymakers, all these things, they want, what are your values? Where is the number? These things we have to propagate it. So they look for policymakers, look for where are your data? Show
Right,
me.
sir.
Let's work in that context. Number one. Number two, economic workout, you have to do it.
Rationality factor of economics.
So there are some studies says, if you spend 1 rupee for a greenery, urban greenery, it will give you 34 rupees worth of health benefits. These type of thing is help the policymaker to do this one. Let us work together. Right brain, left brain, work together and convince the policymakers to adopt ourselves, save our mother nature. Let's live on this earth. Mother also feel very happy. I think for the past 2 decades, the carbon dioxide buildup is phenomenally very, very high.
Right.
So for the 150 years, it was only 31%. Now it's gone up to 90%. Having the carbon dioxide now to 450 part per million, temperature going to go up to more than 2 degrees by the end of this century. Bringing down the carbon 50 is very, very must. We have to work together. There is no time gap. We have to work together. We are in a very crucial stage, and otherwise the irreversible damage, and nobody can able to live on this earth if we continue the same way. We have to work hard together. All the right brain, left brain has to work together and convince the policymaker to do some indigenous way so solving this problem. Thank you very much for all the participants, and I would definitely thank you, Yoshita, for organizing this one, moderating this program.